A drive that looks simple on a map can take half a day here. Clear skies can turn into snow within minutes. And some of the most famous mountains remain hidden behind clouds more often than they appear. Yet what makes this region unusual isn't how far south it lies, it's how often familiar expectations stop making sense. This is Patagonia. A vast region shared by Chile and Argentina, where wind, ice, and distance shape nearly everything. Over the next journey, we'll travel through towering granite peaks, isolated roads, ancient forests, massive glaciers, and coastlines where wildlife still follows rhythms older than civilization itself. Because the deeper you go into Patagonia, the more obvious one thing becomes. Maps don't always tell the full story. Weather rarely stays the same for long, and life here often moves according to conditions that nobody controls. By the time the journey reaches the southern edge of the continent, that reality becomes impossible to ignore.
On a map, Patagonia doesn't seem especially complicated, yet once you're here, distance begins to mean something entirely different. Stretching across southern Chile and Argentina, the region covers more than 1 million square kilometers. That's larger than many countries combined, yet much of it remains almost empty. Roads cross open plains for hours without passing a single town. Fuel stations become landmarks, and turning around isn't always as simple as it seems. Then there is the wind. Powerful air currents travel across the Southern Ocean before colliding with the Andes, creating some of the strongest and most persistent winds anywhere on Earth. Gusts regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Drivers slow down. Hikers lean into the wind just to stay balanced. Weather forecasts become useful guides rather than guarantees. Clear skies can give way to rain or snow, even during summer. People who live here rarely find that surprising. Uncertainty is simply part of the landscape. Distance stops being measured only in kilometers. Progress becomes a matter of weather, road conditions, and patience. And nowhere does that relationship become more obvious than among the granite towers, glaciers, and turquoise lakes of Torres del Paine. Few places reveal Patagonia's unpredictable nature more clearly than Torres del Paine National Park. At first glance, the landscape almost seems too dramatic to be real. Massive granite towers rise nearly 2,900 meters above glacial lakes and wide valleys, creating one of the most recognizable skylines in South America. Yet, appearance alone doesn't explain this place. Conditions change constantly. Within a relatively short distance, open grasslands give way to rocky slopes, ancient forests, and massive glaciers. A calm morning can become a battle against strong winds by the afternoon. Even the colors refuse to stay the same. Depending on sunlight, mineral content, and weather conditions, the lakes shift between deep blue, turquoise, and pale green. A few kilometers can completely transform the landscape. Guanacos move across open plains. Condors circle high above the cliffs. Ancient ice fields feed rivers that cut through valleys shaped over thousands of years. Behind it all, the southern Patagonian ice field continues its slow movement, gradually reshaping the region. There are few barriers between people and the elements. Wind moves freely through the valleys. Clouds gather without warning. Conditions that seem perfect in the morning could look completely different only hours later. Even one of Patagonia's most famous landscapes follows its own rhythm. And as the granite towers fade into the distance, the scenery begins to soften. Protected waters replace open valleys. Snow-covered mountains retreat toward the horizon. For the first time, signs of permanent settlement begin to appear along the fjords of southern Chile. A quieter side of Patagonia waits ahead. After the exposed valleys and granite peaks of Torres del Paine, Patagonia suddenly becomes quieter. Puerto Natales sits along Última Esperanza Sound, a deep fjord surrounded by snow-covered mountains and cold waters stretching far into southern Chile. At first, the town feels almost out of place. After so much wilderness, streets, small harbors, and rows of houses bring an unexpected sense of calm. Yet the landscape still dominates everything around it. Snow-covered peaks rise directly behind the waterfront. Changing skies reflect across the fjord,
and strong winds continue to sweep through the town, reminding visitors that nature never really stays far away. Long before it became a gateway for travelers, Puerto Natales existed to support isolated communities scattered across southern Patagonia. Even today, the town remains surprisingly modest. Despite welcoming people from around the world, it has never grown into a major city. The mountains remain larger than the buildings. The water feels wider than the streets, and daylight itself behaves differently. During summer, evening light lingers far longer than many visitors expect. Time begins to feel less precise. Schedules become flexible. Weather determines plans, and patience becomes part of everyday life. Perhaps that's why Puerto Natales feels different from most places. Civilization exists here, but it never truly overwhelms the landscape. Eventually, the shelter of Ultima Esperanza gives way to greater distances. Settlements become rarer, roads grow longer, and ahead lies one of the most unusual routes in South America. A road built not to conquer the land, but to follow it. The Carretera Austral. In most places, roads are built to make travel faster. The Carretera Austral feels different. Stretching for more than 1,200 kilometers through southern Chile, it connects some of the most remote communities in South America. From the very beginning, the landscape dictated how that connection would happen. Mountains blocked direct routes, rivers cut through valleys, dense forests covered enormous areas. Instead of forcing its way through, the road bends, climbs, and narrows around whatever nature placed in its path. Large sections remain unpaved even today. Sharp curves, gravel surfaces, and sudden weather changes keep journeys slow and unpredictable. Yet, speed is not what defines this route. Waterfalls spill directly beside the road. Suspension bridges cross powerful rivers. Snow-covered peaks appear unexpectedly between thick forests and deep fjords. The scenery changes constantly. 1 hour may bring rain and low clouds. The next, sunlight breaks through to reveal bright green valleys fed by glacial rivers. Even short distances can take far longer than expected. Traffic is rarely the reason. The terrain decides the pace. Travel itself becomes part of the experience. There are no massive highways here, no endless lanes cutting straight across the landscape. The road adapts because the land leaves little choice. And perhaps that is why driving through Patagonia feels so different. People don't move through the region on their own terms. They move according to the conditions the land allows. Farther along the Carretera Austral, another contrast begins to appear. Dense forests replace open plains. Rain becomes more frequent. And high above the valleys, walls of ice emerge where they seem least expected. Because in this part of Patagonia, glaciers and rainforests exist side by side, and that combination changes the journey once again.
Rainforests and glaciers are not supposed to share the same landscape. Yet, in Patagonia, they do. Deep within Chile's Aysén region, Queulat National Park reveals one of the most unusual environments in South America. Moist air arriving from the Pacific feeds dense temperate forests filled with moss, ferns, and towering evergreen trees. Rain falls frequently here. Streams rush through narrow valleys. Waterfalls seem to appear around every corner. Then, something unexpected emerges, above the trees, a glacier. The hanging glacier of Queulat descends from the mountains, suspended high above the forest like a frozen river caught in midair. Meltwater pours down from the ice, creating waterfalls that disappear into the vegetation below. The contrast feels almost impossible. Frozen landscapes and living forests occupy the same space. The explanation lies in the mountains themselves. The Andes trap moisture along the western slopes, creating conditions that support both ice and dense vegetation. Over thousands of years, that balance has shaped an environment unlike anything found farther east. After heavy rain, clouds drift through the valleys. Mist rises from the forest floor, and patches of ice suddenly emerge above the canopy, revealing a landscape where seasons and ecosystems overlap. Everything here is connected. Water flowing from the glaciers feeds rivers. Rivers carve valleys, and the forests thrive because of the same conditions that sustain the ice above them. Further south, another kind of unpredictability begins to dominate. Not in the forests, not in the lakes, but high above the valleys themselves. Because some of Patagonia's most famous mountains are only visible when they decide to be.
Some of the most famous mountains in the world are visible almost every day. Patagonia's are not. In fact, seeing Mount Fitzroy clearly often depends less on distance and more on timing. Rising more than 3,400 meters above southern Argentina, its granite spires dominate the landscape around El Chaltén. Yet, clouds frequently gather around the summit, hiding the mountain for days at a time. Even visitors who spend several days here sometimes leave without ever seeing the peak completely exposed. Nearby, another mountain proves even less predictable. Cerro Torre stands slightly lower, yet its narrow granite tower and constantly changing ice formations have earned it a reputation as one of the most difficult mountains on Earth. Strong winds and rapidly changing weather challenge even experienced climbers. Height alone doesn't explain the reputation of these peaks. Their granite walls rise so abruptly that they seem disconnected from the valleys below. Then, just as suddenly as they appear, clouds can swallow them once again. Morning sunshine can turn into snow by afternoon. Clear skies can disappear within minutes. Weather forecasts become educated guesses. For many visitors, Patagonia teaches an unusual lesson. You don't decide when the mountains reveal themselves. You wait. And when the clouds finally part, even briefly, the experience feels less like sightseeing and more like timing. Nature follows its own schedule, and nowhere is that easier to understand than on the vast lakes below, where ice, wind, and water continue shaping the landscape long after the peaks disappear behind the clouds. Farther south, the mountains slowly surrender to open water. The noise of the wind begins to fade, and ahead lies a quieter world, one defined by reflection, ancient forests, and distances so large that the opposite shores sometimes disappear into the horizon. After the storms, the mountains, and the constantly changing skies, Patagonia reveals a different side of itself, one that feels quieter. Lago Argentino, the largest lake in Argentina, stretches across more than 1,400 square kilometers, fed by glaciers that have shaped the region for thousands of years. From many points along the shoreline, the opposite side simply disappears. Haze and distance blur the horizon, making the lake feel less like an inland body of water and more like a cold, quiet sea. Yet the surface is rarely still for long. Icebergs broken from distant glaciers drift slowly across the water. Strong winds move through the basin, turning calm reflections into waves within hours. Changing light transforms the colors of the lake throughout the day. Deep blue becomes pale turquoise,
Silver reflections appear beneath heavy clouds. Even here, the landscape refuses to remain the same. Farther north, Los Alerces National Park offers a different kind of scale. Ancient forests surround crystal-clear lakes and rivers that seem almost untouched by time. Some Alerce trees are more than 2,000 years old. They were already ancient when many civilizations were still in their earliest stages. Clear water reveals submerged trunks and rocky bottoms. On calm days, reflections become so perfect that it becomes difficult to tell where the forest ends and the lake begins. Nothing here feels rushed. Time itself seems to slow down. And perhaps that is what makes these landscapes so memorable. Not their violence, not their height, but their stillness. Eventually, the forests begin to thin, mountains grow lower, and the continent itself starts to break apart. Because beyond these ancient waters lies a region where Patagonia finally reaches the edge of South America, and where land gradually gives way to sea. Eventually, Patagonia reaches a point where the continent itself begins to break apart. Beyond the mountains and forests lies Tierra del Fuego, an archipelago separated from mainland South America by cold channels and powerful seas. Even by Patagonian standards, this region feels remote. Strong winds sweep across open plains. Forests grow lower and thinner, and the weather remains unpredictable throughout the year. For centuries, isolation protected much of this landscape. Large areas remain sparsely populated, shaped far more by geography than by development. At the southern edge of this fragmented world sits Ushuaia. Surrounded by snow-covered mountains and the waters of the Beagle Channel, the city is often described as the southernmost city on Earth. But standing here, labels begin to feel unimportant. Because what leaves the deepest impression isn't how far south this place lies. It's the feeling that the continent itself has finally run out. Roads end, mountains give way to the sea, and beyond the horizon lies nothing but open water and Antarctica. Even here, life continues beneath constantly changing skies. Ships move through the Beagle Channel, clouds race across the peaks, and weather reshapes the landscape from one hour to the next. Yet the mountains still press close behind the city, the ocean still stretches endlessly ahead, and the forces that shaped Patagonia remain larger than anything built by people. After thousands of kilometers, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The farther south the journey goes, the less the world bends to human expectations. Because Patagonia never learned to adapt to us, we learned to adapt to Patagonia.